Hello everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, New Threat Vectors for ICS SCADA Networks and How to Prepare for Them, sponsored by CyberX. My name is Carol Auth of the SANS Institute, and I will be moderating today's webcast. Today's featured speakers are Mike Assante, the SANS lead for ICS and SCADA security, and Phil Nere, VP of Industrial Cybersecurity for CyberX. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to Mike.
Thanks, Carol, so much. And good afternoon, everybody. Some of the folks out there in the global security communities had a very busy morning this morning. We'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation here. Also, I noticed on the Twitter sphere that somebody talked about the graybeards and quoted me. So I suspect I feel old this morning. What's really great about being a part of this community is I'm always eager to learn things, and Phil promised me today, my co-presenter, that he's going to provide some information where I'll take away some learning. So I'm excited about that as well. So let's go ahead, and Carol, if you could give me the next slide. Let's go ahead and talk about new threat vectors for ICS and SCADA networks. And really, a lot of these threat vectors aren't necessarily new, but our observation about their importance is really coming very clear. And so we want to go through that as well. So we'll hit the next slide. So I want to talk to you about three models. When we look at ICS, it's probably fair to say that there are three primary types of cyber threats that's reflected in the incident catalog when you take a look at cybersecurity incidents that impact ICS systems. We have insider type of attacks in terms of the broad area, targeted attacks, and opportunistic attacks. And I want today to focus you in on the targeted and opportunistic attack. However, there have been some very notable insider attacks, right? So 2014, we have a fired employee who shuts down utility field networks receiving metering data. 2009, there's the insider access that deletes files and at a particular nuclear power plant. And then, of course, going back to 2000, one of the early incidents that really shaped some early thinking about ICS security was Vitbot and the sabotage of the Marucci Shire sewage control system. Those were all performed by insiders. But it's also another type of pseudo insider is the opportunistic attack. It's where individuals inside an organization unwittingly help somebody, or we make bad decisions relative to architecture, for example, and in those cases they allow for vectors for things like infections. And a good example of that would be the 2014 Monju nuclear power plant infection, where an individual inside was an unwitting participant that allowed that to happen. So today I really want to talk about, on the targeted side of attacks, we'll begin there. We'll look at process attacks, things that disrupt the process. We'll even take a look at espionage, and I think we have a very important story to tell here, and it's one that even was very surprising to me in preparation for today. And then on the opportunistic side of things, we're going to look at things, particularly we're going to focus in on ransomware and what we've seen here, the motivation being extortion, of course, or potentially just damage, and that the cover is extortion. So let's take a look at these two areas as it relates to cybersecurity control systems. Carol, if you could take me to the next slide. Now, let's begin with a target attack model. It helps us to provide some context. ICS compromises or attacks can be simply stage 2 related activity, that is, somebody compromises the security of a control system and they're exfiltrating information, for example, and they might use that information later for a planned impact or attack, something that culminates into something that disrupts the process. We use this general scale here, this graphic, to understand the level of investment the attacker must put into the attack. So sometimes it's easier to compromise ICS security to find yourself on an ICS system, for example. An example of that might be Black Energy 2, exploitation of internet-facing local HMI, as an example. Exfiltrating information from the environment might be, again, something that's a little easier. For example, the OPC module within Havx being able to read tag information off of a OPC server. And disrupting an ICS might be as simple as bringing something very noisy into the network. But we typically find that it gets very difficult to actually cause planned and predictable outcomes like process disruptions. Now, let's take difficult with a little bit of salt, because I think Phil's going to talk to you, and I'll talk to you a little bit about a few incidents that demonstrate that attackers have been investing time and energy in understanding how to disrupt control systems, and that's reduced the overall difficulty as they bring new tools to life. So we'll go to the next slide here, Carol, if you could, please.
I clicked it. Did it take?
It did not.
All
Apparently, we're having a bit of a slide advancement issue.
Go.
Carol, if you could work on that as I continue. Yeah, if you could pause there for a minute. I just want folks to digest that. This was the graphic I was talking about. You can see there difficulty being in the middle of the radar scope and a little easier being on the outside. Also, I've color-coded some of those dots to show you type of incidents that are usually easier to recover from, like the compromise of ICS security. You find out what happened, what went wrong, you close the hole, you add a control. And then more difficult to recover from would be something that disrupts the process, or an attack that finds itself in a very deep aspect, like let's say living in the firmware of a controller. Those things will take a lot longer to restore and recover from. If we go to the next slide.
Mike, go ahead and click into the viewer and I'll see. Yep, now you should be able to advance using the arrows.
Great. Thank you so much for fixing that. Attackers performing target attacks usually begin with a goal in mind, or they might gravitate to a goal once they've achieved access. They've learned a little bit about the environment, and they've achieved some level of freedom of action, meaning they decide, I'm going to do something and this is what I'm able to do. When it comes to control systems, we think about these types of goals related to the industrial process itself. And in this case, I provide some objective categories. Things like loss of view. Can I deny view to the operator, to the control system itself? Loss of control. Can I cause you the inability to control the process? And therefore, I might actually take over and manipulate control. And so these are some of the objectives we worry about when we think about cyber attacks that impact the process. And this is where we see a big change from normal IT enterprise types of attacks, where you might be getting your hands on information, pulling the information out of the environment. You might be damaging hosts within the environment, and you could still do that in a control system. But that result of those actions might be things like, I lost my HMI host, therefore I no longer have a view or an ability to control my process. So we like to think of outcomes in that domain, Vice, the way we typically talk about outcomes in an IT enterprise. Now, I'm going to provide a very quick sketch of target attacks, some major, what I'll call highly notable ICS target attacks that look like this. This table here rates how customized each attack was to operate against a control system and rates the impact of the attack, which may be different than what the attacker's goals are, to be honest. Sometimes when things go wrong for the attacker, they accidentally stop a service or a process, or they congest a network segment, they might themselves get unintended outcomes. Or and things don't go the way they want, they could actually still impact the process. But this chart attempts to put these highly notable incidents in context. You'll see on the left-hand side where we see a little bit of customization, particularly on how to deliver attacks, as kind of bulked up a stage 1 type of attacks, meaning these attacks were noticed mostly in the IT enterprise. They had modules that might have some ICS flavor to them. They're mostly focused on access and finding information of even whether an ICS was there, and if one was there, collecting vital pieces of information that might allow the attacker to what we call cross the gap into stage 2. Stage 2 typically actually has an impact. It's a concept to act against the control system environment in a cyber way or cyber means. Examples of that would be Stuxnet as a high water mark, highly customized, had a very significant impact to everything all the way down to safety because it was able to damage machines under control. Ukraine power outage in 2015 was a disruption, opening manipulation of control by opening circuit breakers. In 2016, we saw this at a transmission level, but the tools that were used might have been more customized for control systems. We'll talk about that in a minute. And of course, we're all familiar with the German ironworks or steel mill where a furnace was damaged that was under control. And so that's just a kind of a, if you will, a bit of a mapping of some target attacks. Now let's talk about some of the most recent targeted technical threats that we've seen out there. A highly targeted and customized ICS technical threat, which was described and revealed by ESET earlier this month. They named it Industroyer. The coverage also included some great work by Rob Lee with Dragos, labeling the same malware analyzed as CrashOverride. This malware looked to be an extremely modular, flexible tool that had specific payloads which would allow the person in control of the malware to be able to interact with the control system environment, to be able to read communications, to be able to inject communications. In some cases, there are modules that were designed to wipe key files that were tuned towards the control system. And in other cases, there are payloads that could actually exploit a vulnerability within control systems. Most of the malware did not exploit vulnerabilities. Most of the malware payloads were designed to actually operate as this control system is designed in terms of interacting as a protocol library or communication module to actually use the control system. We're finding a lot of attacks are focused on simply hijacking or using the control system's capability to operate the system, obviously in an unauthorized manner, in a manner that you don't want to see happen. So if I can, I'd like to contrast those 2015 attacks against Ukrainian distribution entities with the 2016 attack in December against a transmission operator that really impacted a single transmission substation, but resulted in a rather large, we say outage, or basically the types of megawatts that would have been being served that weren't served were even more than the 2015 attack. But what's also interesting is it's possible, based on the work of ESET and Dragos, that aspects or portions of the CrashOverride malware might have been used to cause that outage. And so, whether it's not confirmed that malware, as has been revealed to the world, was used in totality or in pieces, but it clearly had the capability. And so if you do a quick comparison, malware in the 2015 distribution attacks were focused mostly on gaining access initially to the IT enterprise by using droppers and phishing mails, and had remote access Trojans to allow for backup ways to communicate with the compromised environment. And finally, there was one module that was used, Kill Disk, to take on Windows host, particularly host machines, desktops like HMI host, and servers like SCADA servers. And those all culminated in hijacking the system using some native tools in order to do that. It was very interactive and manual. And the attack itself had some use, like we said, of Kill Disk to damage by overwriting key files and damaging master boot records. Well, this 2016 attack, the malware or payloads or scripts might have had a much bigger role. The malware that's been analyzed has a, if you would call it, autonomous self-directed capability. Once it's been tuned and the settings have been established, it could kick off logically, be scheduled in order to actually operate. So the attacker doesn't need that remote interactive access anymore for the attack itself. It was highly targeted, and then it's modular and customizable. So it's kind of very significant, if you will, in our world to think about this new malware in terms of what it allows an attacker to do. My key takeaway for the malware, in my opinion, is that it reduces the total time necessary for an attacker in order to be able to collapse that time to actually go from ICS access to impact, and that's significant. Now, how should we think about this targeted type of attack? Well, there's some key risk items to consider in terms of how risky is this for you. Obviously, the SCADA path management, the ability for an attacker to get into the control system environment and deliver this tool is important. If the tool is there, the idea that knowing the payloads that we know of today, although I would caution you, I'm not sure we know of all the payloads, but the payloads that were analyzed clearly interacted using the IEC 101 protocol, 104, IEC 61850, and that is an operational capability to receive communications and actually communicate using those protocols, potentially denial service of communications. And so if you don't use those protocols, if you use those protocols, you'd say, I'm really at risk to the capabilities as demonstrated. Also, you'd look at this and you'd say vulnerability management in terms of remote devices. Like I said, it had an exploit that could be used against the Cyprotech, which is a Siemens protection and control device. If you have that device, again, that risk is present. The tool had a ability to exploit it. If you use OPC, there was an OPC module. And then finally, obviously, almost everyone's exposed to the final risk, which includes data destruction. If they tune the wiper module, they could tune it to your environment if the attackers are there. So here's a way to think about the risks that are involved with this type of a target attack. And let's go ahead and turn to what we know, what we don't know. What was analyzed would demonstrate for some people out there, they might say, I don't use those protocols, I don't have that protection and control device in place, and therefore I believe my current likelihood and consequences of this malware being significant to me is low. But keep in mind, it's highly modular and flexible. We might not see all the payloads and plugins, and if there are others, we might actually have to consider my current risk or even my future risk once we start to reveal or find some of those payloads could be much higher. So that's a way to think about target attacks. The idea is the attacker can use a lot of flexible ways to get to your environment, lots of different types of flexibility demonstrated in this tool that you can create or engineer payloads. What we do know is these authors were capable of engineering payloads, right? So why stop at those ones? If they target your environment, they might be able to have the time and energy and investment to actually create a payload for you. So keep that in mind. So the next thing I'd like to talk to you about, which is really surprising, I really enjoyed doing the homework here and working with Phil on the idea of espionage and data theft. Now, we saw a lot of this in the early 2000 to mid-2000 timeframe where the attacker was very interested in grabbing information related to the control system and, more importantly, the process behind the control system. So there's quite a bit of a misnomer out there that says, hey, in the control system space, attackers want to attack critical infrastructure. Well, guess what? We're finding in the Verizon 2017 data breach report, when you really look at it, there's an incredible amount of wealth of information related to the number of attacks that were focused on industrial manufacturing. 620 data breaches focused on the manufacturing sector last year. 94% of this would be labeled as espionage, as they were pulling information out of the environment. There are indications that much of it might have been state affiliated, so an organized approach to actually pull this information out. Most of the data breaches, the targets themselves would categorize the information that was taken as being highly confidential or secret to them. It was important in terms of recipes, in terms of the process and how they actually conduct everything from maintenance to how they drive their operations. So data theft, again, which is normally thought of in IT enterprise environments, the ICS is a rich place in order for some people to learn, and it's not that dynamic. Think about it. Financial transaction information has a very short temporal life in terms of its value, but how an organization might treat metal, how they might conduct maintenance within a manufacturing environment, what the recipe might be in order to build a widget, those things are long-lasting with long temporal significance. So if I'm interested in competing with you, I might learn a whole lot over time by attacking your control system and learning about how you do business. And I focus on catching up and doing business better than you and undercutting you pricing-wise in the market. So, you know, it's interesting. What makes you an attractive target can be very difficult to ascertain. In this case, the manufacturing industry, I think, is quite surprised by how much of a target they are, and that the target isn't just the IT enterprise, but diving much deeper into the control system environment. So really very interesting outcomes, and big kudos to Verizon, obviously, for helping us here. We're not far into this, and again, I said in the mid-2000 timeframe, we did see a series of attacks where attackers had got into IT enterprises in the critical infrastructure. The attackers are very interested in SCADA-related files. They were doing searches for these files. They're able to identify files and move those files out of the target environments that have significance in terms of both credentials and information about tags and control system types of technology. They exfiltrated key files, which would allow them, quite honestly, when we analyze them, being able to hop over a logical segmentation and gain direct access to the SCADA environment. So significant, very significant. So keep in mind, even if you see an espionage-like attack, you have to project forward and think, does this give them the opportunity and the credentials, if you will, to get into my control system? And it really begs the question, I need better visibility into those environments. So let's talk about ransomware, because we now have the world is awake in terms of particularly systems that used to be shielded behind logical segmentation. In the case of WannaCry, it was an eye-opener because what somebody was able to do was to take a ransomware capability, combine it with an internal, we'll call lateral movement capability or propagator. In this case, a tool set that had been revealed by the shadow brokers that included a zero-day vulnerability that Microsoft was able to create a patch on, but it was able to move across these segments. So WannaCry, by the way, was able to get into a number of control system environments. And in this case, you're talking about mostly nuisance, but you do lose some data and files. There's been disruptions in production as they try to clean it up. It's increased production cost, and it's reduced productivity. It's been an eye-opening experience. Now, this hasn't ended here. Even this morning, we're dealing with a different type of ransomware called Petya A, which has been modified because now they've added an infection vector and a lateral movement capability, again, modeled off of probably SNMP version 1. I know companies around the world are analyzing this, but it has gotten itself into, and it looks like there was a lot of infections in Ukraine. There were at least 5 power entities involved in this, banks, metro system, and other types of enterprises have been involved, to include the government. So broad reaching, we're now seeing it attacking on a global scale. Multinational corporations and European organizations are finding ransomware infections. And so, we have a bit of a crisis this morning. It underlines the importance of understanding, having visibility to determine how far do these things go, and how are they propagating. So again, visibility can be very important here to understand whether your operational environment is getting impacted or has the potential of being impacted based on what you're seeing. It also gives you the ability very quickly to turn around and to try to close those holes, to make sure that that lateral movement capability into a control system environment goes away very quickly. The key that we worry about is impacted assets. In the control system world, you could lose access to key files, which could interrupt or disrupt the control system. And we're aware of a few ransomware attacks where everything, even down to difficult to consider files like the license for your control system, that you couldn't recover, so you had to go back to the supplier and get new license just to be able to recover from this. And so I would recommend that people think pretty broadly about what ransomware could do to your production environment. Now, it's important to note that the maturity, when you think about both opportunistic attacks and target attacks, and by the way, the blend where a target attacker actually uses a more horizontal tool like ransomware in an opportunistic fashion, by the way. These types of attacks have very different outcomes depending on your maturity. I like to think of the attacker effort and say, look, if you have an immature system, low process maturity in how you secure your control system, then the attacker enjoys less investment necessary to have an outcome. You, in this case, might actually have incidents already going underway that are unnoticed. Maybe your control system security is compromised. Attackers are already interacting with the control system environment, moving information out, and you're not aware because you don't have visibility in your control system. You don't have tools in there. You don't have endpoint security solutions. In that case, we make it a little too easy. Now, as you grow in maturity, you significantly, in kind of a medium process maturity, you really start to remove a lot of the opportunistic attacks. Now, you yourself might carry in malware on USB sticks or on technician laptops, for example, but you've got the capability to quickly contain, identify, and deal with those. And so we find that medium maturity organizations typically are aware when attacks begin to occur with an impact, when they really get noisy, and they have some capability to respond to those attacks. Finally, high process maturity folks are probably have been bitten by one of these attacks, and they're very organized to deal with those and to move on. And so I really encourage you, and you'll hear from Phil about ways to get mature, and I think that's going to be really, really important. So let me turn real quickly to what types of controls and mitigations do we see out there as it relates to these models. We talked about opportunistic attacks, we talked about target attacks, what makes them different, how do they work, and let's talk about some of the controls that people are using out there. Now, in the SANS 2016 ICS survey, we had this breakout. If you look at this pie, one of the leading controls out there were use of NIST guidelines, and I think that's exciting, as well as the use of the CIS critical, what we used to call the critical controls, or the 20 critical controls, a good 37% share. And then you see a smattering. If you're an electric utility, of course, you're going to be using NERC compliance of your bulk electric system entity. And then we see the fallback on the traditional ISO control family, and which, by the way, is the basis of a lot of these other controls. And then IEC 62443 is an example with the 24%. And so you see that diversity in control families, but keep in mind there are a lot of overlap. And by the way, the SANS 2017 ICS survey will be released in the July timeframe. That's exciting because Phil and we have others participating, and we'll be sharing that information to you. So let's go ahead and take a look at just a couple of these families. And particularly, let's look at the NIST 882 guide. I really like the evolution. This guide has been around. It's been evolving. It focuses on understanding and establishing how do you secure control systems. It gives you an overview of risks and how to think about the bigger risk management, which is a strength of the NIST guidelines. It talks about vulnerabilities and has a series of mitigations that you could use. This guideline is not customized for any particular industry application, so you see examples that will touch on different applications, and the controls that it suggests would focus on that as well. But let's talk about a very specific guideline that came out that focused on situational awareness, and it did so particularly for electricity systems, right, electric utilities. And this was the NIST special publication 1800-7. And in this case, they really dug down and said, how can you achieve situational awareness? And I've talked to you now about the importance as it relates to both opportunistic and target attacks of gaining situational awareness. This guide gives you a little bit of a how-to cookbook. It suggests that in bringing and integrating together information sources available to you. It goes from everything from looking at syslogs and the control system itself and the production information coming out of the control system to combining that with tools that are available, either open source or commercial tools, that would allow you to ensure and gain visibility and tie that all together to make better risk management decisions in the background. And that's the important part, is the idea of having a full view of what you're up against so that you can reduce and collapse the response time necessary to get back into production. And so you put that in the bigger context of the cybersecurity framework or the CSF guideline, that NIST guidance is just a building block. I do like the model of identifying. You have to know your systems. You have to have some protections to reduce noise. You have to have some ability to detect, i.e. visibility into that environment, integrate as much data sources as possible to aid you in your response and recovery. And in every attack we've seen, if you develop capabilities across the spectrum, you position yourself to reduce the consequences associated with these attacks. And that is critical. The current presidential executive order is trying to strengthen this for not only federal networks, but also recognizing the importance of critical infrastructure. But again, the Verizon report tells me that we need to go beyond what somebody might say, well, I'm not an attractive target because I'm not critical infrastructure. Well, guess what? If you make money and you bring value to the marketplace, you're probably an attractive target. And so with that, I'm going to turn over for Phil. And Phil, you're going to educate not only the audience, but me, and I'm excited to co-present with you here.
Great, Michael, thank you. This is Phil Neray from CyberX, and Michael, thank you for your thoughtful overview of the risks and controls. Carol, do I have the control here? Let me see. Yeah, here we go. Okay. So I'm going to give some additional background behind some of the threat vectors and the threat actors in particular that we are concerned about when it comes to industrial control networks, and then I'm going to wrap up at the end with some examples of how we can reduce the risk and mitigate the risks associated with those threat actors. So you might ask, what's the big deal about industrial control system security? Why now? And if you look at this historical timeline of this book called Hacking Exposed that was released in the early 2000s, written by George Kurtz, Stuart McClure, looking at network security from a hacker's point of view and a hacker's perspective. A lot of us grew up on these books, and you can see the evolution over time as we realized, well, okay, so networks are one place to start, but there are other parts of the attack surface you can go after: Windows, web applications, Linux. And then at the end of last year, McGraw-Hill released this book called Hacking Exposed ICS, written by Clint Bodungan and two other guys. And it's an excellent primer. I would highly recommend it to either folks who are more familiar with the IT security side and want to learn more about the ICS side, or ICS folks who want to learn more about security. It's about how do you think of the attack vectors and how do you do some threat analysis on the ICS system. We're pleased, of course, that our research was featured in Chapter 7 on threat intelligence and vulnerability research, but overall, I think it's a great book. So what's driving this interest in cybersecurity for the ICS side? Well, number one, as most of you know, OT and IT are converging. It's tied to business initiatives to gather more information from the OT environment, run analytics in the cloud or somewhere else where you can look at that data and do a better job of optimizing your processes and predicting maintenance failures and all kinds of things you can do with analytics that you couldn't do 10 or 15 years ago when these OT networks were installed. And that, of course, increases the attack surface because now you've got more sensors, you've got connectivity between IT and OT. The air gap goes away, doesn't exist anymore, and that increases risk. Second thing is that we are now seeing a range of cyber attackers with different motivations. So a lot of us think about the Ukraine, we think about nation states and geopolitical aggression, but as Mike explained, we're now starting to see other attackers such as cyber criminals looking for financial gain. We're seeing folks looking for theft of corporate IP that could be your competitors. And hacktivism, if you produce a product or you produce it in a way that certain groups aren't in favor of, they could easily come in and cause havoc in your OT environment just like they could on your IT environment. And then finally, industrial networks are easy targets. A lot of them still rely on perimeter security and antivirus, kind of the way IT networks were about 10 or 15 years ago. Because many of these protocols were designed many years ago and simply encapsulated in IP, they lack authentication or they have weak authentication. And the traditional perimeter approach doesn't protect against insiders, whether they're malicious or careless, and whether they're actual employees or whether they're third-party vendors connecting their laptops to your OT network to perform maintenance. We need new ways to get visibility into what's going on the OT side and to get visibility in industrial malware and targeted threats that Mike was talking about. So here's some other examples. In late December, the Wall Street Journal wrote an article about how a Michigan utility was hacked with ransomware. And I think that was a big eye-opener for folks to realize that ransomware wasn't just about tying up your PCs. We discovered an operation in the Ukraine that we announced at RSA involving organizations in energy, scientific research, infrastructure, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second, but it was a cyber-espionage operation, very sophisticated, probably requiring nation-state capability. And then some of the malware that Mike talked about in the first part of the presentation, we've seen evolve over time. So last spring, we realized that black energy had evolved and now was being used for data exfiltration. Interestingly enough, using SMB protocol, which we've seen show up in the WannaCry attacks recently. And then at the end of last year, we looked at kill disk in our threat intelligence research group and realized that it had evolved from being simply a destroying kind of malware to being ransomware, could actually encrypt your files. And we attributed this to the Telebots group, which we believe is an evolution of the Sandworm group, which we all know were behind the Black Energy campaign. So, cyber attackers are agile and will continue to evolve their malware, as we saw in the slide that Mike talked about comparing the 2015 and 2016 attacks in the Ukraine. And then finally, part of the research we do is into 0 days, and part of this is to show that if we can find these 0 days, then any well-resourced organization with malicious intent can also find these 0 days. That could be a nation state. or it could be a cyber criminal organization. And if you think about reliance on firewalls as a key control separating IT and OT networks, finding a 0-day in the firewall kind of makes it pretty easy to go from one to the other. So this is an announcement we made last year at the ICS Security Conference in the fall. Let's talk about some of these in a little more detail, but first, this is a slide that came out of DEF CON 2014. I showed it in the last SANS webinar, and sometimes I do feel like we're looking through the looking glass, and that only increases as we find out more and more about what's going on in the world of cybersecurity. And so, some of the examples I'm going to show you now would open your eyes, I think, to the fact that we are living in a new kind of world. So let's talk about Bug Drop. Bug Drop was an operation that we discovered earlier this year, targeting organizations in Ukraine, very sophisticated, capturing all kinds of data, including audio. That's why we called it Bug Drop, because it bugged conversations. And then the drop came from the fact that it used Dropbox for data exfiltration, which meant that most organizations don't block that kind of traffic, so very easy to get data out of the corporate network using Dropbox. It also used a sophisticated malware technique called DLL injection, same as the ones used in Stuxnet and Black Energy. Also in the attacks that were described last week in the attacking the IDT Corporation, using DLL injection, which makes it very easy to put the malware into the system without AV or traditional controls finding it. He used encrypted DLLs, which made it even harder for AV tools to locate it. And unlike many attacks that use dedicated domains that you can then go back and find out, well, who registered this domain, who can we tie this to, this one used free web hosting services for their command and control. So it was a very easy way to hide the identity of the attackers. Another interesting malware botnet that we found was called Radiation. This was before Mirai, and unlike Mirai, it relied on exploiting a 0-day in the web server of CCTVs. So unlike Mirai, which could be patched or fixed, theoretically, if you could log into your CCTV and change the default credentials, this one could not, and in fact, the manufacturer of those cameras has not released a patch for it either, so there's no choice. And we've found that this botnet army of 25,000 devices is being used for DDoS for hire services. They're being advertised on Alphabay, and just to show off what they could do, the hackers took down 4 major Russian banks last November on the day of our US election. So you can imagine the same DDoS for hire service being targeted to anybody that somebody doesn't like. But since they have root access to those CCTVs, they could also use it for cyber-espionage, and they could also use it as an entryway into your IT and OT networks, from which they would move laterally to the assets that you care even more about. So let's talk about this article that appeared last week in Wired, written by Andy Greenberg, and it was about Ukraine being used as a test bed for Russian capabilities. And I want to go first to this ICS CERT advisory that was issued at the end of 2014. It was the first time that we were publicly talking about Black Energy and ICS CERT acknowledging that this malware had infiltrated US infrastructure. And then the quote from the article about how whoever's been attacking Ukraine has gone after practically every sector of the Ukraine. And a quote from Marina Krotofil that, in 2015 they were brutal street fighters. That was the left-hand side of the slide Mike showed before. But in 2016 they were ninjas with their autonomous capability, with the fact that the malware understood native industrial protocols and could work in an automated, self-directed way to destroy the equipment they were after. And one of the ideas suggested in the article is that this is just a way for whoever's behind these attacks to test the red lines, to see if they're getting pushed back. and if not, to try the next step. And we've seen this escalation over time already. And one of the theories would be, for example, if Russia were concerned about U.S. Putting crimps on their geopolitical goals of expanding into other parts of Eastern Europe, they could use this as a negotiating weapon to challenge us not to do it. And there's a tweet here from John Hultquist, who's from FireEye, was one of the first guys to look at sandworm from earlier this year. He posted this tweet about, well, you know, if you look at all of the things that have been going on, would it really be surprising if the same malware, A, was retargeted to the US and the protocols that we use here as opposed to the protocols used in Europe, and B, the malware that was used in the 2016 Ukraine attacks is very modular. It's a framework. It's built the way we build our software. In other words, it would be very easy to add modules to target US protocols, not just in utilities, but in other industries like manufacturing, pharmaceuticals, and chemicals. This is a presentation that was made at DEF CON 2015, and it was the first time personally that I had seen someone talking about hacking of ICS infrastructure not related to destructive, but related to stealing information or holding the company hostage until they paid a ransom. And a very interesting quote in this one was, they used OPC to gather details about connected devices. Well, guess what? That's what the most recent attack in the Ukraine using Industroyer did the same thing. And then this little quote here that says, well, we haven't seen this same malware being used with destructive payloads, but there's no reason why, you know, we wouldn't see that in the future. And in fact, we did see it at the end of 2016, as we now know. So let's move on to WannaCry for a second. As Mike mentioned, it's taken down manufacturing production lines at Honda, Nissan, Renault, probably others. You know, unlike in the consumer retail or financial services industry, there's no requirement to disclose breaches of the OT environment. There's no regulatory requirement to do that unless it has a significant financial impact, in which case if you're a public company, the SEC says you should talk about it, but that's still left at the discretion of the management team. So I think one of the reasons we haven't heard more about these types of attacks, both the intellectual property attacks and this type of nuisance malware, is that there's no regulatory requirement to do it, and you know, most companies would rather keep it quiet. But I think this will wake up management teams and operational teams to the fact that this is something we should be concerned about. So let's talk about IP theft for a second. This comes from a presentation that General Keith Alexander, former commander of the Cyber Command, made in 2014, I believe, in which he said, the loss of our IP through cyber-espionage constitutes the greatest transfer of wealth in history, $250 billion per year, and then he tacked on about another $100 billion for losses due to downtime. Obviously, this covers both IT and OT environments, but as Mike mentioned, there's a lot of IP stored in the databases that we find on the OT side and the historians, and then the ladder logic itself. A lot of that information could be used to recreate formulas and recipes that are the key assets that a lot of our companies rely upon. So who might be some of the threat actors behind these types of attacks? Well, China has a national strategy to advance its industry by taking intellectual property from the West. And this picture of Unit 61398 in China and the map on top showing where we believe they're located, you know, to me says that these guys, you can bet they're looking for ways to get their hands on the latest exploits released by the shadow brokers like Double Pulsar to advance their goals of stealing IP. That's their goal. Other people might have other goals, but we think, you know, that would be a great way for them to go get some of this IP. And we know that tools frequently migrate from nation states to cyber criminals. So you can imagine cyber criminals also using advanced tools to get your IP and then selling them on the black market, or selling them to your competitors, or selling them to the highest bidder. So it's not just nation states, it's also cyber criminals with financial interests that are interested in your IP. Some more stats from the DBIR. This one shows that out of all the different verticals tracked by the DBIR, manufacturing is the #1 by far, targeted by cyber espionage. And then if you look at it in a different way, out of all the attack vectors going for the manufacturing sector, cyber espionage is the #1 attack vector compared to other approaches that cyber attackers could use, such as privilege misuse. And this one, which was mentioned in Mike's presentation, which is out of all the things that guys are looking for in manufacturing, the bad guys' trade secrets are the #1. And you can think of, especially in an industry like pharmaceutical, the IP is worth a lot more than any physical asset that the organization might own. So one of the things to keep in mind is that ICS environments are easy targets. This quote from Deloitte, a study they did on manufacturing, says that about 1/3 of manufacturers have never, ever conducted a vulnerability assessment, and most, or 50%, only do them occasionally. And it's not surprising. The traditional ways of doing vulnerability assessment are manual, time-consuming, cause disruption to your environment, they're expensive, they're variable quality because they depend on the skill of the folks doing the vulnerability assessment. And so what we're seeing is a move towards automated vulnerability assessments that are non-disruptive to your OT environment. And I'll talk about that near the end. And so one of the questions to ask yourselves, if you're talking to OT folks and they're telling you, hey, we're all set, we have controls in place, we have firewalls, we have antivirus, the question to ask would be, if your OT network were in fact already breached, how would you know about it? Sometimes people say, well, we have IT security tools deployed, so that should be enough, isn't it? And you can see here that there are a lot of differences between IT and OT security. For number one, protocols are different. In OT security, we have some standard protocols, some proprietary protocols, but the industrial protocols are different than the standard protocols you find in IT. So a tool that was designed for IT protocols will not work in OT, and it will not have visibility into those protocols. Of course, you find the IT ones as well in the OT side. Secondly, if you have an analytical tool that's designed to spot behavioral anomalies on the IT side, which is primarily about humans clicking on links or various things going on in a Windows box, those algorithms don't translate well into the machine-to-machine environment you find in OT, where it's deterministic as opposed to non-deterministic. So, on the left-hand side, IT, you might be using Bayesian analysis, totally not suited to the machine-to-machine communication, which is deterministic on the OT side. On the IT side, you could use a tool like Nessus to do vulnerability scanning, but you can't use active scanning on the OT side because it creates downtime. And on the patching world, a lot of people, when WannaCry came out, said, patch, 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 that's the solution. Well, you can't easily patch in the OT world, A, because it creates downtime, and B, because those systems have been in place for a long time, running 24/7, and it's not that easy to upgrade to the latest version of Windows without invalidating all the work you've done so far and the fact that the systems are working fine as is. So let me wrap up with a brief overview of CyberX and how we can help. The company was founded 4 years ago by military cyber experts who are responsible for securing their own critical national infrastructure. Our global headquarters are in Boston, that's where I am today. And it's an industrial cybersecurity platform that was built from the ground up for OT. So it's not a repurposed IT solution. It performs continuous monitoring, looking for threats and anomalies. It performs non-invasive risk assessments and asset discovery. It incorporates ICS-specific threat intelligence. It integrates very quickly with what you already have, your SIMs, your industrial protocols that you have in your environment, and it's a very open system. So for not only detection, but for incident response and threat hunting, it provides a variety of capabilities to dig into the data and investigate threats. We have our own in-house ICS threat intelligence team that are former incident response team for the IDF. So these are world-class nation-state capability kind of guys and girls, ladies. And we have deployments worldwide and across all of the industrial domains. Our behavioral analytics is a key aspect of our differentiation. It's based on something we call industrial finite state machine modeling. Relies on our deep understanding of industrial protocols. It models the network as a deterministic series of states and transitions between states, and uses machine learning to learn what those are in your network, and then very quickly uses that to detect anomalous behavior with minimal false positives. And it works on both cyber anomalies and operational anomalies. So for example, if a power supply is starting to fail and jitter, that will be something that will show up in the network traffic. And another advantage over traditional IDS systems or antivirus systems is it doesn't rely on rules or signatures. There's no configuration required, and it can be deployed and running in less than an hour. It connects directly to your OT network through a span port or a tap, so it's non-invasive, it's passive collection, and it has no impact on your operational network. We grab a copy of the data, bring it into our system, run the analytics on it, and then you can import additional information, such as information from your CMDB or your firewall rules, to enrich the analytics that we provide, for example, to identify rogue devices that you might not know about in your network. We've been recognized by the industry in a number of ways. Gartner rated us a cool vendor, mentioned our in-depth visibility and threat intelligence. SINET 16, sponsored by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and DoD, gave us the Innovation Award, one of 16. That's where the 16 comes from. And we were the only industrial cyber vendor selected for that award. And then the Industrial Society of Automation selected us again as the only industrial cyber vendor recognized for innovation. Mike mentioned the NIST cybersecurity framework. Here's a quick look at how we would support all 5 categories of the framework, from the identify step to identify your assets and risks, such as insecure devices, to the protect state, identifying vulnerable or weak firewall rules, integrating with firewalls and IPS systems to automatically block new threats, and a partnership we just announced this morning with Waterfall Security, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. They are seen as the industry standard for unidirectional security gateways, and they've verified and validated our solution as interoperable with their solution and selected us as their first partner for a partner ecosystem program that they announced today as well. On the detect side, continuous real-time monitoring, advanced behavioral analytics, and the threat intelligence, which enriches our analytics. And then on the response side, we talked about the forensics and investigation tools, but also the integration with SIMs and other solutions you already have in place to support automated workflows. And then finally, on the recover side, automated reporting to enable communication between all your stakeholders. And then finally, wrapping up with how CyberX would have protected against Industroyer, I've picked 3 examples of anomalies that would show up in our analytics. The first one is the reconnaissance phase, when the malware was using the OPC protocol to identify its targets. That would quickly show up as anomalous activity, as well as the fact that the scanning would generate a higher volume of traffic than was usual. Second example would be the fact that the malware reads and writes to a variety of targets using multiple protocols. It iterates against information object addresses, IOAs, many of which don't exist. That would generate errors, and that would be identified as anomalous activity. And then it attempts to execute commands on all the addresses that were found, some of which are of a type that don't support the commands that they're using, and that would also return errors. So all of that would show up as anomalous activity. And then finally, the command and control aspect, where the C2 happens through a local proxy that was installed in the environment prior to this attack. We haven't found out exactly how they did that, but we know if they had Black Energy and Kill Disk and other tools installed from previous attacks, that they would be able to roam around pretty freely in the OT environment, install that local proxy. The proxy is listening on TCP 3128, and then communicating with an external C2 server over Tor. Well, all those things would show up as suspicious. There's no business reason to communicate from an OT environment to a Tor server through the network, and so that would show up immediately as anomalous activity that you could then dive down into. So wrapping up, for more information, check out our ICS Security Knowledge Base, where you can download the first 2 chapters of ICS Hacking Exposed, the book I talked about earlier. You can visit us at a couple of conferences coming up, EnergySec in August in California, European Utility Week in the Netherlands in October, and then come see us at Black Hat, where we're going to be giving away copies of the entire book. So Hacking Exposed book, it's a 390-page book, and we're going to have a book signing with the lead author, Clint Bodungen, on Wednesday of Black Hat at 3 p.m. So join us then. Obviously, the books will go fast, so it's only while supplies last, but we look forward to hanging out with you at Black Hat and talking about some of these things we talked about today. And now I'd like to say thank you, and let's look at some questions that we might have. We open up the questions window. So I guess these were all slides from earlier asking about, most of the campaigns we've seen targeted energy. How come we haven't seen any campaigns target the manufacturing sector or pharmaceuticals or chemicals? And kind of as I talked about before, the high visibility attacks like the Ukraine definitely targeted the utilities, but given the motivations of cyber attackers to look after, to go and grab your intellectual property or to deploy ransomware, it would not be surprising if we saw that in the future, or that it's already occurred. It just hasn't been reported. A, because as we talked about before, there's no regulatory requirement to report on those types of breaches, but B, most organizations in manufacturing do not have the visibility to detect if they were breached or being attacked. So a big part of the reason why we haven't seen it is we don't know about it. So it could be there already today.
That's right. That's right. If I could real quickly, please. I think it's important to note that the highly notable incident where we actually saw destruction of equipment or damage to physical equipment were 2 manufacturing operations, right? The German steel mill was a furnace, and then Stuxnet was going against uranium enrichment, which is just manufacturing a product, which is more enriched uranium. So the truth is, some of our biggest, most notable incidents that are out there being discussed by the broader community actually were manufacturing. The recent energy campaigns and things that we've seen, keep in mind, Havex and Black Energy 2 campaigns for access were widespread. They didn't just focus on energy companies as well. So I think Phil's absolutely right in his response.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And then finally, a question about pricing. What's our pricing model? Our pricing model at CyberX is based on the number of appliances required to monitor the environment. These can be either physical or virtual appliances, and the analytics can be on premises or in the cloud. And the pricing is based on the number of appliances you need, which is determined by the volume of traffic in your environment and the number of monitored devices. So it's a very simple, clear pricing model. Basically depends on how much is going on in your environment that needs to be monitored and analyzed. And then finally, what is the biggest challenge for OT cybersecurity? I mean, in my view, it's a question of awareness and education. Many of our management teams aren't aware of the risks. Over time, the IT part of the house has become very aware of the risks. There were well-publicized breaches like Target. There were, impacts on the C-suite from those types of breaches. And so that's raised the awareness, and it's no longer a question of educating management about the need for continuous monitoring, analytics, and some of the newer ways we have of detecting targeted attacks. On the OT side, I think it's going to take the same thing, and that's why I'm thrilled to be on this webinar with Mike. And with that, I think we'll wrap it up. Mike, any closing words, please?
Yeah, sure. And thank you, Phil, because you did educate me, and I was looking forward to that. I think the last element would be we've talked around one of the most significant challenges being complexity. Complexity in how we're putting our systems together, how our systems communicate, and what should be there and what shouldn't be there. Phil's capabilities in terms of CyberX and what they're bringing to the marketplace is a deep level of insight and understanding, and this idea that we need to make sense of the complexity. We need to bring tools in that allow us visibility. The asset identification and management is critical, I think. So I have a very bullish view of the future. I believe control systems are one of the most defendable environments. We just have to get down to the hard work of knowing our systems, knowing ourselves, and putting the capabilities in place to allow us to see and do from a defense perspective. So thanks, Phil.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Carol. And thanks to our attendees. Don't forget that if your friends haven't seen this webinar, it will be archived and available from SANS going forward.
All right. And also I'd like to add, for those of you on the webcast and any of those of you who will be listening in the archive, any questions not answered during this webcast can be submitted to q@sans.org. Thank you so much, Michael and Phil, for your great presentation, and to CyberX for sponsoring this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.